Okay, Wi-Fi plus 3G, 64 gig. This one.
Oh, sweetie, $900?
I can't wait to see the look on Kyle's stupid face when he sees my iPad has more memory than his.
Remember that time you watched South Park and thought, man, these kids need therapy? Well, you're not alone. In fact, we've brought in a professional to confirm what we've all been thinking. Today, we're taking a hilarious, yet surprisingly insightful look at the mental states of 8 South Park residents. From the elementary school to the adults, no one's escaping our psychological spotlight. It's time to see just how messed up our favorite mountain town really is. All right, let's dive into the fascinating world of Eric Cartman's psyche. Imagine this little bundle of joy waddling into a therapist's office. The poor shrink's probably gonna need therapy themselves after this session. So Cartman plops down on the couch and you can almost hear the therapist's pen scribbling furiously. Where do we even start with this kid? Well, for one, he's got about as much empathy as a brick wall. Remember that time he tricked Scott Tenorman into eating his own parents? Yeah, that's not exactly your average 4th grade prank. It's more like something out of a horror movie. Our armchair diagnosis? Narcissistic personality disorder with a hefty side of antisocial tendencies. But hold on to your hats, folks, because we're just getting started. Cartman's manipulative behavior and his constant need to be the center of attention. That's screaming histrionic personality disorder. It's like he's auditioning for a one-man show called Look at Me, 24/7. And let's not forget his interesting relationship with his mom. I mean, talk about an Oedipus complex. Freud would have a field day with this kid. It's like he's trying to tick every box in the DSM-5. You know, I almost feel bad for the therapist at this point. Their notepad's probably filling up faster than Kenny dies in a season. And that's saying something, considering Kenny's track record. But wait, there's more. Cartman's got more mood swings than a playground. One minute he's plotting world domination. The next, he's crying because someone ate the skin off his KFC. It's like his emotions are on a roller coaster and the safety bar's broken off. And let's talk about his delusions of grandeur. Remember when he thought he was psychic? Or when he convinced himself he was the reincarnation of Leonardo da Vinci? This kid's ego is so inflated, it could probably float the entire town of South Park. Oh, and don't even get me started on his eating habits. I'm no nutritionist, but I'm pretty sure cheesy poofs isn't one of the main food groups. Though with Cartman, it might as well be. Alright, it's time to put Stan Marsh on the therapist's couch. You might think he's the most normal kid in South Park, but trust me, our boy's got some issues that'll make you say, oh my god, they killed Kenny. And I don't mean that literally, whoa. This time, let's start with Stan's outlook on life. Remember when he turned 10 and suddenly everything looked and sounded like crap? That wasn't just a random South Park gag. It's a pretty spot-on representation of depression. Our therapist friend would probably slap a label on it like persistent depressive disorder or dysthymia if they're feeling fancy. But here's the kicker. Stan's cynicism isn't just a phase. It's become his whole deal. He's always seeing the worst in everything, like he's wearing pessimist vision goggles. And sure, living in South Park would make anyone a bit jaded, but Stan takes it to a whole new level. It's like he's allergic to happiness or something. Now let's talk about that time Stan became an alcoholic. Yeah, you heard that right. While most kids his age are chugging Capri Sun, Stan was knocking back Jack Daniels like it was water. The therapist is probably writing potential substance abuse issues in big red letters right about now. Thanks for that stellar parenting, Randy. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite all this doom and gloom, Stan often ends up being the voice of reason in South Park. It's like he's the only sane person in a town full of crazy. But being the designated driver of sanity in South Park, that's gotta take a toll on a kid. So what's our final diagnosis for Stan Marsh? Well, if I were a betting man, which I'm not, because that's Kenny's job, I'd say we're looking at a classic case of dysthymia with a side of existential crisis. It's like he's trapped in a constant state of meh with occasional dips into everything sucks. But don't worry, Stan. Our therapist got a prescription for you. Less screen time. Sorry, Terrence and Phillip. And maybe a nice long vacation from South Park. Though knowing your luck, you'd probably end up somewhere even crazier. Maybe try a nice boring trip to Nebraska. While Stan's off finding himself in the cornfields of Nebraska, let's turn our attention to his super best friend, Kyle Broflovsky. This kid's got more anxiety than a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. And his moral compass is spinning faster than a Drydel on steroids. As Kyle takes a seat on the therapist's couch, you can practically see the lecture brewing behind those eyes. 3, 2, 1. You know, I learned something today. And we're off to the races, people. Our resident voice of reason is in the building, and he's got a lot to say. But hold on to your hats, because beneath that righteous exterior, Kyle's got some serious issues bubbling up. Remember how he's always trying to prove Cartman wrong? That's not just friendship goals, folks. That's straight up compulsive behavior. The therapist's pen is flying across the notepad, and generalized anxiety disorder is definitely making an appearance. And let's not forget Kyle's ongoing struggle with his Jewish identity. Is it just regular teenage angst, or are we looking at some deeper identity issues here? ¿Por qué no los dos? That's why not both? For those of you who don't speak Taco Bell menu. Now, if you thought Stan was a perfectionist, wait till you get a load of Kyle. This kid treats getting a C like it's the end of the world. It's like he thinks that his report card is going to determine the fate of the universe or something. The therapist is scribbling away, and I'm pretty sure obsessive compulsive personality disorder just made it onto the list. So what's the final verdict on our little ginger lecturer? Drumroll please. It looks like we're dealing with a classic case of generalized anxiety disorder with a side of obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Yikes, that's quite a mouthful. Maybe we should just call it Kyle syndrome and call it a day. Let's talk about Kenny McCormick, South Park's very own immortal enigma. You know, the kid who's died more times than I've had hot dinners. Now imagine trying to diagnose someone who treats death like it's just a minor inconvenience. Talk about a therapist's nightmare. So Kenny shuffles into the office, hood up as always, probably mumbling something that would make a sailor blush. The therapist leans in, trying to make sense of the muffled words. First thing on the agenda, how do you even begin to assess someone who's got a revolving door policy with the afterlife? Let's start with the obvious. Post-traumatic stress disorder. I mean, come on, dying on a regular basis? That's gotta leave some serious mental scars. But here's where it gets weird. No one in South Park seems to remember Kenny's deaths. It's like the whole town's got a case of selective amnesia. Can you imagine how messed up that is? You die, you come back, and everyone's just like, oh, hey Kenny, what's up? As if nothing happened. Now, let's not forget about Kenny's home life. Growing up in poverty, dealing with neglect, and having parents who once joined a cult. That's not exactly a recipe for a well-adjusted kid. It's more like a perfect storm for, well, pretty much every psychological issue in the book. And then there's Kenny's risk-taking behavior. We're not just talking about normal kid stuff here. When death is just a temporary setback, why bother looking both ways before crossing the street, right? It's like he's got his own personal cheat code for life. So what's our armchair diagnosis for our hooded friend? We're looking at a hefty serving of complex PTSD, with a side of what we're calling immortality complex. Yeah, we totally made that last one up, but come on, it fits. Now, if we were prescribing treatment for Kenny, we might suggest he try dying less. But let's be real, that's like telling a fish to try breathing less water. What Kenny really needs is some therapy that sticks between resurrections. Maybe we could set him up with a therapist in the afterlife? Just a thought. Alright, so we've covered Kenny's immortal shenanigans, but now it's time to talk about South Park's very own midlife crisis in human form, Randy Marsh. This guy's got more issues than a comic book store during a crossover event. So picture this, Randy bursts into the therapist's office, probably fresh from his latest harebrained scheme. The poor therapist just sighs and reaches for the extra strength coffee. I mean, where do you even start with a guy who's had more careers than a cat has lives? Let's kick things off with Randy's constant need for attention and validation. This isn't just a midlife crisis, it's a midlife marathon. Remember when he decided he was actually the pop star lord? Or that time he got so obsessed with the Food Network that he started cooking meth? Yeah, that's not just quirky behavior, folks. That's a cry for help louder than one of Mr. Hanky's Christmas carols. Now, I'm no professional, but if I had to slap a label on Randy's behavior, I'd go with histrionic personality disorder with a side of substance abuse. And that's on a good day. This guy's impulsivity is so off the charts, it makes Cartman look like a monk. He changes careers more often than most people change their underwear. One day he's a geologist, the next he's a pot farmer. The therapist is probably scribbling possible undiagnosed ADHD in their notes while Randy rambles on about his latest Tegrity Farms idea. But let's not forget about Randy's relationship with Stan. Calling him emotionally unavailable is like calling a volcano a bit warm. This guy's parenting style is basically do as I say, not as I do. Except he doesn't even bother with the do as I say part most of the time. Poor Stan's probably got enough material from his dad alone to keep this therapist in business for years. So what's the final diagnosis for our friend Randy? Well, if we had to sum it up, it'd be a cocktail of personality disorders that would make even the most experienced bartender raise an eyebrow. Throw in a hefty dose of Arrested Development and you've got yourself a Randy Marsh special. This guy's not just avoiding growing up, he's actively running in the opposite direction. So we've covered Randy's wild ride through adulthood, but now it's time to talk about South Park's very own identity chameleon, Mr. Garrison. This guy's sense of self is more unstable than the town's sanity during a visit from Man Bear Pig. Let's start with the obvious. Mr. Garrison's got more personalities than a psych ward on Halloween. One minute he's a dude, the next he's a lady, then he's back to being a guy again. It's like he's playing musical chairs with his own identity. Our poor therapist is probably wishing they'd gone into a less complicated field, like quantum physics. Now you might be thinking, oh, that's just good old gender dysphoria. But hold on to your therapy couch, because that's just the tip of the psychological iceberg. Mr. Garrison's identity crisis goes way beyond gender. He's been gay, straight, and everything in between. It's like he's trying to collect sexualities like Pokemon cards. And let's not forget his interesting coping mechanisms. Remember Mr. Hat? That hand puppet wasn't just a teaching aid, it was a cry for help. Our therapist is probably scribbling notes faster than Kenny dies in a typical episode. But wait, there's more. Mr. Garrison's stint as president wasn't just a career change. It was like he was trying on a whole new personality. It's as if he looked at the most powerful job in the world and thought, yeah, that seems like a good way to figure out who I am. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. So what's the final diagnosis for our favorite shape-shifting teacher? Well, if we had to guess, it'd be a combination platter of personality disorders with a side of unresolved childhood issues. Throw in a dash of impulsivity that makes Randy Marsh look like a monk, and you've got yourself a Mr. Garrison special. Our therapist is probably looking at their notes, realizing they've just written the world's most confusing Mad Libs. They might as well diagnose Mr. Garrison with all of the above and call it a day. So we've diagnosed the wild and wacky adults of South Park, but now it's time to turn our attention to the most cheerful little ball of sunshine in town. Butters Stotch. Our therapist probably thought they were getting a break when this sweet blonde kid skipped into their office. But oh boy, were they in for a surprise. You see, Butters isn't just your average happy-go-lucky kid. He's more like a ticking time bomb of repressed emotions, wrapped up in an adorable package with a bow on top. Let's start with his home life, shall we? His parents aren't just strict. They're the kind of parents that make you wonder if CPS has South Park on speed dial. Remember that time Butters got grounded for, well, existing? Yeah, that's not normal parenting. That's the kind of stuff that makes therapists reach for their emotional abuse rubber stamp. Our poor therapist is probably scribbling repressed anger issues in their notepad while Butters cheerfully recounts his latest grounding for breathing too loudly. But wait, there's more. Let's talk about Butters' alter ego, Professor Chaos. Now, most kids have imaginary friends or pretend to be superheroes. Butters, he created a supervillain persona complete with an origin story that reads like a cry for help. It's like his brain said, you know what? If I can't express my anger normally, I'm gonna create a whole new personality to do it for me. And don't even get me started on Butters' gullibility. This kid would believe you if you told him the sky was green and made of cheese. It's not just naivety, it's a pathological need to please others that would make most therapists weep. Our poor shrink is probably considering early retirement at this point. So what's our armchair diagnosis for our dear Butters? Well, we're looking at a classic case of adjustment disorder with a heaping side of what we're calling people-pleasing syndrome. Yeah, we made that last one up, but come on, it fits Butters like a glove. But here's the real kicker. Despite all of this, Butters remains optimistic. It's not just admirable at this point, it's bordering on delusional. This kid has been through more trauma than a soap opera character, and he's still skipping around South Park with a smile on his face. It's enough to make you wonder if he's secretly the most well-adjusted person in town, or if he's one you're grounded away from a total meltdown. It's time to put the school counselor on the couch. Mr. Mackey floats into the therapist's office, and you can practically see the question marks popping up over the therapist's head. I mean, how do you even begin to unpack this guy? Let's start with the elephant in the room, that verbal tick. Every other sentence ends with Mackey, and it's not just annoying. It's like a flashing neon sign pointing to some deeper issues. It's almost as if Mr. Mackey is constantly seeking approval or reassurance. The therapist jots down potential anxiety disorder while trying not to visibly cringe. Now, remember that time Mr. Mackey lost his job and went on a wild bender? That wasn't just a bad day at the office. That was a full-on meltdown. The therapist writes impulse control issues and difficulty coping with stress in their notes. I'm pretty sure going off the deep end isn't in the counselor's handbook, but hey, South Park isn't exactly known for its stellar employee support system. Speaking of being a counselor, let's talk about Mr. Mackey's effectiveness. His go-to strategy for dealing with complex issues? Drugs are bad, McKay. That's not counseling. That's a bumper sticker slogan. The therapist sighs and adds limited therapeutic techniques to their growing list of concerns. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite all his quirks and questionable methods, Mr. Mackey genuinely seems to care about the students. He's like a well-meaning but utterly clueless uncle trying to navigate the treacherous waters of adolescent psychology with nothing but a pool noodle and a positive attitude. The therapist leans back, tapping their pen against their notepad. They're torn between admiration for Mr. Mackey's dedication and concern for his obvious struggles. It's like watching a one-legged man in an ass-kicking contest. You want to cheer him on, but you also kind of want to call it off before someone gets hurt. So, what's the final verdict on our favorite school counselor? Well, it's a mixed bag. On one hand, we've got a guy who's clearly dealing with his own set of issues: anxiety, possible substance abuse, and a serious case of imposter syndrome. On the other hand, he's still showing up every day, trying his best to help in a town that's basically a 24/7 crisis factory. So there you have it. We've just taken a wild ride through the minds of South Park's most notorious residents. From Cartman's narcissism to Kenny's immortality complex, this town is like a DSM-5 playground. But hey, maybe that's what makes it so darn entertaining. Next time you're watching an episode, remember you're not just laughing at crude jokes and outrageous scenarios. Nope, you're witnessing a masterclass in abnormal psychology. It's like a psychology textbook came to life and decided to run amok in a small Colorado town. And let's be real, after this deep dive into the twisted psyches of South Park, we might all need a little therapy ourselves. I know I do. Maybe we should book a session with Mr. Mackey. On second thought, maybe not. McKay,